As the light shines on me, I find myself inspired to discuss something similar, which involves the way we think in terms of nature. And so I had a discussion about this yesterday with someone, but there are two ways that we broadly conceive of the word nature if we speak of nature. And that might seem like a total reduction because, in fact, there's a multitudinous variety of variegated ways in which we can express what we mean when we say things like nature. So, as a symbol, nature can fail to be fully captured in this way, which is okay. But there are two ways in which I find nature, at least as a kind of unification of a certain kind of step forward, can be thought of. And so, when we think of nature in the sense of a totality, in the natural order, the universe, the cosmos, the stars, the ecology of the stars within their own galactic framing, and then the stars as giving birth to planets, and the planets as giving birth to further chemical stabilities, and then those stabilities destabilizing into what we think of as terrestrial ecosystems, and then terrestrial ecosystems giving birth to life, and life giving birth to questions, right? So this form of conscious awareness of the relationality between that entire sequence. Nature means, and it's funny to say birth in all these senses, like is it an empty abstraction to talk about the birth of a planet? Well, nature means, in a certain sense, one of its Latin kind of derivatives, or sorry, not derivatives, but one of its Latin roots is the word birth. So it's like that through which something is continuously born, or the generative process through which it comes. So that is one way to think of nature, right? This totality, but that contemporarily is thought of in terms of physical events, so the physical universe. And so our, I guess, broadest and ironically our most minute description has to in some sense be unified into a totality. And so we think of the physical universe, and the flawed carryover of 17th and 18th century scientific materialism that Whitehead critiques, Alfred North Whitehead, pretty intensely in his Science in the Modern World. And so there's a way in which, I didn't plan that, by the way. There's a way in which nature has been thought of in terms of a totality. But often, if we look back at the scientific materialist point of view, often this totality is itself guided by a more governing, more totalizing, more holistic principle. And so the rationalists of the 17th century were guided by the conception of God. And God was the unifying entity that brought this kind of this step out of the direct experience, like empirical. We have to have a higher, an ordering principle in order to even consider this unification of what becomes empirical science to be worth doing, right? And so nature in that sense is one conception that has somehow shunted off its higher ordering principle and now is thought of as a disparate form of again, variegated voices. So, and by voices I mean the way that waves, events, quantities are replaced by frequencies in the modern conception. And so the event of a subatomic particle is the consideration of its it's tracing, it's showing us of some kind of implicate order that we define, and we look at it in terms of amplitudes and frequencies and some kind of non-static universality that appears in and out of existence, some kind of unfolding of an enfolded reality that we can peer into but not fully see. This seems like something of a tangential way to think, but there is no unifying principle to what we call nature as this totality anymore. There's no way to fully sum it up except for to say nature in that way. And so I said in the very beginning, there's two ways to think of nature. And so one of them is this physical picture of the universe, which has to include a lot of pretty powerful attempts to describe and depict and model the reality, and then our technical apparatus, which endeavors to arrive at that reality, to have full confrontation with it. And so we could talk about that all day. That's what I usually talk about on this channel. But the second form of what we mean by nature is something, if you look up the definition of nature, there's two definitions. There's the physical ordering of events, and then the second would be some distinct character or identity, or we might say essence, which is drawn from the philosophical in a more definitive way. Like, in essence, the nature of a thing bears the brunt of its kind of Platonic ideal. And we don't think of that as critically as we should or could, because for us to consider the nature of a thing is to assume something beyond that thing's direct empirical relation to us. And for us to not only assume, but to interact with and see that thing as, the language of thing here is such a failure, because when we think of character, when we think of identity, when we think of essence, we think so far beyond what is considerably a thing, what is some tangible glass or cup of coffee or some kind of thing I can drink or take in, or, The essence of coffee is not its taste or its smell or anything. It's some unifying principle that holds it all together. And so the real tension between these two is to exude and push the second formulation of nature out of what we consider to be the grand totality. Because if you hadn't noticed, in order to describe the physical universe and nature writ large, we have to use the second conception, which is this essential character, you might say. So we can ask the question, what is the nature of nature? And that's a perfectly intelligible question, but it might seem more like a fun game of language. But if we can't talk about a totality in terms of, or within the proper framing of a generality, then what's the purpose of talking about nature at all? I think the core focus that I'm trying to bring out in this question of what is the nature of nature is these two conceptions are precisely in dialogue with one another. There's no way in which how we sum up the physical universe can tell us what we mean when we discuss summing anything up, except for if we see these as an interaction. If you think that a physical model describes everything in the universe, you're, I think, deluding yourself and not seeing that this is a relational frame. This is a dialogue. This is a binary. Not that this is a quantitative binary, like some kind of 0 or 1, but that the interface is only existent by a complex interaction of zeros and ones. And so even to look at your computer screen is to interface with it. It's not directly to see some kind of physical conception. By the way, I'm not against any kind of physical framing of things. It's just the generality of what we mean by philosophical essence, or the second form of what I call nature, not to be confused with what is called second nature, which is like the human imprint on the natural order. The kind of second nature as human beings are able to come and build themselves out of what seems like the natural constraints of ecological or terrestrial ecologies, even to the point where we're in combat with them. This second conception is actually broader and more encompassing. than what the first conception is when we think of some kind of physical universe. At least that's what I would hold.